Welcome, everybody. You guys just get seated. My name is Craig Maxwell. Nice to meet all of you. I am the Southern Piedmont Chapter Chair for the North Carolina Native Plant Society. I brought a bunch of materials from the North Carolina Native Plant Society over there on the table. Love for you guys to take it home with you. We've got plenty of extras if we run out and you need to take some home. I am here today to talk to you all about native plants, which it sounds like there's a lot of interest in, which is very exciting for us. Particularly hearing that the Master Gardener Group is interested in this. It's something that we've tried to get more interest in with Master Gardeners over the last few years, and it sounds like there's been a lot more questions about it in the last few years, which is awesome. A little bit about myself. I grew up in Matthews area, went to NC State, came back, been in North Carolina as long as I can. I wasn't born here, but grew up here. I have been with the North Carolina Native Plant Society since 2020. I joined during COVID. I got bored. I got more into gardening, and then I went down podcast rabbit holes about gardening, and that got me into native plants and ecology, and it's kind of spiraled out of control. And I've been the chapter chair for the Southern Piedmont since the beginning of 2021. Our chapter hosts monthly meetings at Reedy Creek Park in Charlotte, the second Sunday of every month. We also do those virtually, so you can register on Zoom and watch it live. We upload all of those presentations to YouTube, so all of our past presentations for the last several years are on there as well. It's been a big project that the whole state organization has been working on. We have 7 chapters throughout the state, and I think the other closest one here is the newly resurrected chapter up in Asheville called the Land of Sky chapter, but there are 7 statewide. So before I get started, how many people, I guess I would imagine most of you have heard about native plants. How many of you have just started hearing about native plants maybe in the last 5 years? A few people? Maybe in the last 2 years? Okay, so, and that's been pretty common. That's been what we've seen. We've seen a lot of increase in our membership over the last few years because there's been this big surge of interest in native plants and what they are, what they aren't, and how to get them into your gardens. So to start off with, the big question, what are native plants? And the answer can vary depending on who you're talking to. Some people define it in slightly different ways. The main definitions you'll hear, it's grown in a particular habitat for thousands of years. It's evolved alongside the other plants, animals, fungus in that habitat for a long period of time. Some people define it as plants that were here prior to colonization, prior to Columbus coming in, and there's a lot of plants and seeds being moved around the world at that time, and that's when you see this big shift from native into the ecosystem that we see now. But I think the most important part of that is that it's connected to the local ecosystem. We'll get a little bit more into that connection. And does anybody, I'm going to have a lot of pictures up here of native plants. I want to kind of get a gauge for which of these plants you've seen before, which you are common to you, and which ones are new. Does anybody recognize any of these 3? Joe Pye weed there in the middle. Bee balm on the left. Have you heard of that? Virginia bluebells here on the right with some shooting stars there in the background. Virginia bluebells I love. They pop up first thing in the spring. They turn a slightly deeper shade of blue, more like that, by the time they're done blooming. And at the end of spring, every part of the plant dies back to the ground and it disappears the rest of the year. Really pretty spring flower, though. And then, what are invasive plants? That's what the conversations kind of go hand in hand. It can get very dicey and very argumentative depending on who you're talking to, of how much we need to get invasive plants out of people's properties, out of the market, things like that. And I think it's important to understand what we mean when we're talking about invasives. First off, they are non-native, so they're everything the previous slide was not. They grow in really fast and unchecked rates, or they reproduce in very unchecked rates. Either they're very prolific seeders, or they spread really quickly by rhizomes. Whatever it is, they spread quickly, and they're hard to get rid of. They're hard to eradicate. That may just be because, for example, like Japanese stilt grass, if any of you have heard of that, it kind of takes over some woodland ground cover areas. And it has a very long seed bank. It has a 7-year long seed bank where you kind of have to go in and either tear out all the soil that was there, or go in and spray with with herbicides every year until it's gone, because they're very hard to get rid of. They don't have the same sort of ecological pressures that native plants do. That is because, as I'll get to in a little bit, they didn't evolve alongside all the animals in this area that would eat those plants, or any of the other plants that would normally compete for that same sort of space. And they typically originate from similar climates to ours. Some of the most common invasives that we'll talk about on the next slide and this slide are from either the Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, or Northern Africa. You see very similar climates where you have, it's close to the coast, you have a temperate climate with a lot of warm air coming in, and it's all right around the same latitude for the most part. Plants do really well moving across the same latitude. They don't really do well moving north to south because of the change in temperature, the change in sunlight, and things like that. So that's where you see a lot of our invasives are from those regions, because they've grown up in that same sort of climate. Most of you are probably familiar with these three here, right? We've got Japanese honeysuckle, kudzu, probably the most proliferous, probably the most well-known one, and then crepe myrtles. All things that, growing up in the South, particularly with the Japanese honeysuckle and the crepe myrtles, growing up in the South, I'd seen everywhere. I just assumed it was part of our local flora. It is now, but we're trying to get them out of here. And then some other really common ones. Nandina, up there on the top left, or heavenly bamboo, as some people call it. Not only does it spread very quickly by rhizomes, and when you try to pull them up, any bit of the root that's left in the ground will sprout a whole new plant. They're very tough to get rid of in that way. Yeah, and then the berries that you get on them are toxic to a lot of our local birds. It's not as much of a problem for birds that pick one or two berries here and there and fly to another plant. It's more of a problem for birds like cedar waxwings, where they will come and they will pick a whole plant clean, they'll move along to a next one. And it's that high quantity of berries that they're eating at once that's really toxic to them. So when we talk about invasive plants, if you can't necessarily get rid of the plant, you can at least prevent it from going to seed or fruiting or things like that. You can contain it a little bit. We've got English ivy. English ivy is everywhere. Rose of Sharon, it's in the hibiscus family. Seeds very well, unfortunately. Bradford pears, down in the bottom left. They're everywhere. They're easy to spot in the spring because they're one of the first trees to flower. So you'll see them along the highways, just nice, bright, and white. And that's why they were so marketable, is because they're one of the few trees that blooms that early in the season.
They were marketed as not being able to reproduce.
Correct, yes. That's a perfect example of one that was said that they are sterile versions of the Callery pear, but then they crossbred with a native pear, and then we got the Bradford pear that we have now. So it was supposed to stay contained. They thought they knew what they were doing, and it got out of hand. And you'll see South Carolina has a bounty program, some of you may be aware of. They're working on some in North Carolina, but it's not as widespread as they have it in South Carolina, to get rid of Bradford pears and replace them with natives. You've got autumn olive, Elaeagnus. You'll see these, they'll start to fruit the next month or so, I believe. But they're one of the first plants to put out leaves in the spring, early spring, late winter. And they take up a lot of the sunlight that the other woodland wildflowers might get coming up at that time of year. They spread very quickly, and again, they're if you don't get the entire root up out of the ground at once, they're just going to keep growing. They actually like it if their roots get disturbed, and so it's you want to either cut it all the way down to the ground and treat the stump with herbicide, or you're just going to have to come back and do a lot more manual pulling year after year after year. And the last one we got here is the mimosa tree. Again, I grew up seeing this all the time. I associate it with, I used to go down to Alabama as a kid with my grandmother every summer, and they were all around the house where we stayed, and I just thought that was part of the South. So I'm learning more and more of these plants over the years that I just I had ingrained as this is Southern flora. The question that usually comes up when you start talking about these. A lot of people will ask us, well, I've got plants growing, isn't that a good thing? I've got greenery, and that it seems like a healthy environment. So part of it comes down to a concept of right plant, right place. Plants have their different types of water levels, soil chemistry, sunlight requirements, and ecological partners that they need to survive. And so finding the right place for them to grow is really crucial. If you have something that's, let's say this Kentucky bluegrass up here, you're trying to grow it in the shade, and you're not providing it with enough water, it's not going to do very well. In fact, does anybody know where Kentucky bluegrass is native to? You think so? It's actually native to Morocco. Again, that northern Africa region where some of these will come from. It was marketed as Kentucky bluegrass because they figured people would think, it markets very well here in the South. But it is not from this area. It has very shallow roots. Doesn't do well with our rain patterns and our soil type combined together. Meanwhile, you've got switchgrass here on the right, which is a native. Much deeper roots. Doesn't have the same sort of water requirements. It does better with our soil without any need for fertilization. Right here you've got pin oak trees or scarlet oak that have clearly been underwatered, scorched by the sun. If you're planting something in an area that needs more water and it's not getting that, you're going to tell very quickly. Flame azaleas, they are a native. They need high acidity in your soil. You tend to see a lot more azaleas in the wild in pine forests, where you have the pine needles dropping the high acidity in your pine needles, creating more acidity in the soil, and they do really well there. If you don't have that acidity, which we do in this area, particularly with our clay soils, we tend to have a higher acidity, then they're not going to do very well. They're not going to bloom probably, they're not going to look very healthy. And then down here on the bottom right, has anybody seen a pink lady slipper orchid out before? I've seen a handful, but they're getting fewer and further between. Most orchids only have one pollinator that they deal with. They have very specific requirements in terms of the type of insect that pollinates them. They also have very specific requirements, a lot of them, with fungal partners in the soil. They can't always get the right nutrients they need out of the ground, so they partner with fungal species in order to kind of round out their nutrients. So without all of those things, you're not going to get the plant that's as healthy as it needs to be, that's putting out fruit, that's putting out blooms the way you want it to, because it's not in the right place. And kind of zooming out some from the health of the plant, if we want to look at the health of the ecosystem, all food webs are built on plants, right? They are what capture your light energy from the sun, turn it into sugars for everything else on the planet to eat and thrive upon. Without plants, we're all dead in the water. And so local food webs rely on local plants, rely on native plants in order to function properly. Most, I want to say 90% of insects are not going to be able to eat any plants that they didn't evolve alongside over the last several thousand millions of years. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of evolution to get to where insects are with their specific enzymes, with the specific makeup of their digestive system to be able to eat a specific type of plant. Plants have tried, as long as they've been alive, to survive, and the way they'll do that in some ways is developing chemicals in their DNA that make it difficult for other plants or for other animals to eat. They may be bitter to the taste, they may smell awful, they may have thorns on them, whatever it is, but however they adapted to try to survive, you typically have these insects that have evolved alongside them also evolve in very specific ways to be able to digest those plants. We take it for granted how much we can eat as a species, what the range of things that we can eat, but for insects specifically, there's a very limited number of plants that they can digest most of the time. And then moving up the food web from there, your birds and your amphibians, your reptiles, they rely on insects for food. Baby birds, a large amount of their diet as they're growing up is caterpillars and worms, those sorts of things that caterpillars specifically have very specific relationships with native plants. That's where you get the term host plant. So the term that kind of incorporates a lot of that is coevolution, right, which is the influence of closely associated species over time during their evolution that's resulted in these very specific niches that each of them fill balance each other out. You've got right here on the top right, you've got monarch butterfly and common milkweed. This is probably one of the most well-known host-plant relationships that people are aware of is milkweeds and monarchs. The milkweed plant, if you've ever grown it or you've ever torn the leaf or seen the leaf cut, it produces a milky sap. The milky sap is toxic to most insects, most caterpillars, most butterflies. But monarchs have developed a way to not only be able to digest that better, but they've also developed different habits when they eat it to cut the leaf down here at the midrib so that less sap is pouring out to the top of the leaf where they start eating their way down. It's those sorts of relationships that get built over a long period of time that they have to develop. And then down here on the right, does anybody grow figs? Right? If you've got a species where you need more than one in order for them to pollinate, their pollination happens with very few or in some cases only one species of wasp. Has anybody ever seen a fig flower? No? So a fig flower is not what you'd think. It's an inverted flower. The pollinating parts of the flower actually turn inside. So what looks like a small fig as it starts growing is actually the flower. And you have wasps that will crawl inside the tiny little hole here at the end and either lay their eggs on the inside or they'll be pollinated in the processes that are going between them. In fact, some wasps, as they're crawling in, it's such a small space that it'll just tear their wings off and then they're just there for the rest of their life. And so you have these very specific relationships that are needed in order to pollinate and keep these species alive. So these relationships, like what species are eating what species, what sort of environment do they use to call home? Is it a certain species of tree? Is it old home of another bird species? Maybe a mammal has crawled inside an old tree snag where a bird has made a home, and then the mammal takes over, and then several years later, as that hole opens up, an owl takes over. There's very specific niches that each of them fill in order to survive. So when we're talking about right plant, right place, I know growing up, I had learned in middle school, we had the three regions of the state. We had the mountains, the Piedmont, and the coastal plain. It's a little more nuanced than that, especially when you start looking at your climate regions with our topography, with the mountains. You have the sand hills down here, different habitats in the southern coastal plain versus the northern coastal plain, and you overlay that with all of the different soil types in North Carolina. We tend to think of clay as our most common one, but we have a lot of different soil types across our state. So between the combination of the different types of sunlight that a given spot receives, the different types of rain and temperature and the soil that it's growing in, you're going to create all of these very different regions for these plants to grow in, where we in the Southeast have a very large number of endemic species. Endemic meaning they only grow here. They don't grow anywhere else. They grow in a very small, specific area, and there's very specific attributes that allow them to survive. If you take them outside of that region, they're just not going to live. And as a result of those different climates, the different soils, plants have developed all sorts of different root structures in order to adapt to those conditions. We have here in Charlotte more rainfall per year usually than Seattle or Portland. But it tends to come in these big downpours. We get an inch at a time, whereas they get a constant mist or light rain. So as a result, what happens in our soil is we get these huge downpours. The soil has to be able to absorb that water or runs off into our creeks and rivers. And then you get these spells of dry periods in between those. And the plants have to figure out a way to adapt to that. A lot of them in this region have done that by just growing really deep fibrous roots. You may have seen pictures online of native grasses versus turf grasses, and how a lot of native grasses, they'll be about this tall above ground, but their root structures are 2 to 3 times as long underground. They get 10, 15 feet deep down into the soil, so that as things dry out, they're still able to access water further down into the soil, and they're more adapted to that climate. Over here on the left, so these are all mostly native plants. Over here on the left, this is turf grass. Very shallow root structure, We tend to keep it cut very short so that it can't, keep feeding nutrients back down to the roots so that they can develop more deeply into the soil. So you have something that it's not really meant to grow here. We're watering all the time, we're fertilizing all the time, we're cutting all the time. And for a crop that we don't really get any food out of, we put a lot into it. So we're really trying to, I'll show an example later of, people talk about getting rid of the lawn or removing turf and replacing it with natives. And this is why. It also helps when you have those floods, it helps our stormwater systems to react better or to adapt better because they're not getting hit with these huge gushes of water because a lot more of the water is getting soaked down into the soil through the roots. It gets down into the water table more slowly, replenishes our aquifers, and when you have these mass stretches of lawn with deep or with shallow roots, the water can't really get down very far, especially with clay soil like we have. It's hard to penetrate that. Like I said, here in the southeast, we have a lot of endemic species, but we have one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. The Amazon rainforest, Southeast Asia, some of those areas with the tropical rainforest, they are very high. Outside of those regions, the southeast of the U.S. is one of the most diverse regions in the world. One of the reasons because of that was during the last ice age, you had these glaciers coming down from the north. They made it to around here, and the warm air, that temperate climate here in the southeast, kind of kept that off for a little bit longer. Meanwhile, all of these species that were living down here in the southeast, they continue to survive. Some died off because of the changing climate, but a lot more of them survived than where climate's recovering. So what you get at the end of the ice age is not only all of these species that have survived, but those glaciers have brought all sorts of seeds from the seed bank that they've scraped over as they've moved across the continent, and they've deposited those into the southeast. So we get this new mix of genetic material coming in, and it really helps create a unique ecosystem down here in the southeast. On the left, you'll see biodiversity of vascular plants in the U.S. So that's anything that's not moss or algae, and then tree biodiversity here. Alabama specifically is the most diverse region in the United States when it comes to amphibians, reptiles. Right around here between Tennessee and Alabama, you have a huge biodiversity in freshwater fish that you just don't see anywhere else in the country. And you have a high number, like I mentioned, of endemic species as well. So these hotspots here are where you have 30 plus endemic species that just don't live anywhere else in the world. So we have a very unique ecosystem here that it's been really exciting to learn. So getting back to insects and their relationship with plants, is anybody familiar with either of these?
The saddleback caterpillar?
It is a spice bush swallowtail. And then here on the right is the spice bush. And you may see these some of the first flowering bushes in the spring in your creek areas, in your wetland kind of areas. They have these tiny little flowers. So this is very zoomed in. And then a lot of them are going to seed right now, or they're putting out their fruits right now, so you'll see those bright red berries out in the woods. The spice bush swallowtail, that is its host plant, right? So it needs the spice bush in order to survive. The butterflies will come in to lay their eggs on those leaves. They'll eat through those leaves, and that's really all they can digest in that stage. There are a couple other host plants for the spice bush swallowtail. White sassafras is another one, but they are primarily found on spice bushes. Some other ways that insects have learned to interact with plants. Does anybody know what these are on the top left? They look like they might be fruits, but they're actually galls. They're wasp galls. So what these are, different species of wasps have different looking galls, and they interact with different species of trees. And what they'll do is they'll come to the tree, they'll inject a hormone into the leaf of the tree or to the stem of the branch, and that hormone causes a different growth pattern in the tree. So those structures there are actually produced by the tree, but they wouldn't have unless the wasp came in and injected that hormone into it. And that's where they're able to house their eggs, and that's how they're able to overwinter. That's where they hatch out of. And then when they hatch, they live in the tree for a while. Here on the right, you have a little bee kind of tucked into the stem of a branch. A lot of our woody shrubs and a lot of our herbaceous flowers as well that have sort of pithy stem in the middle of it. Over winter, a lot of insects will lay their eggs into that pithy center. They'll hollow it out, or it'll already be hollow. They'll lay their eggs in there, or they'll just stay in there over winter. And as long as the stem stays upright, it's going to stay dry. It's not going to be down on the ground getting wet and getting mold and fungus on it. And then springtime comes, and either the babies or the adults eat their way out of the stems, and that's how they survive. Bottom right or bottom left, we've got all sorts of critters in the leaf litter. There's a big movement right now called Leave the Leaves to really encourage people not to rake up their leaves at the end of the season. And that's because all sorts of species of insects and worms and other invertebrates use those leaf litter not only as food, but some insects will leave their eggs on the underside of these dead leaves, and they'll just stay in the leaf litter until spring. And again, once it starts to warm up, those babies will eat through a lot of the leaf litter. So as long as you're not spraying a ton of pesticides in your area, raking up your leaves into your beds or things like that, your insects will eat through a lot of that by the middle of the next year. So it's not where you have just tons and tons of leaves piling up year over year. They are actually using that as food, and it will kind of ebb and flow. That's why out in the woods you don't just see 3 feet high of leaves. They eat through it. And then down here on the right, I just thought this was interesting. These are not from the U.S. These are leafcutter ants from the tropics, from Central America. And they have a very unique relationship with leaves. If you've ever seen these, they're not actually eating these leaves. They're cutting these leaves, they're taking them back to these massive mounds that they build, and they're collecting them in an area that has fungus growing on the leaves, and they eat the sugars being produced by the fungus. Different species of tree leaves produce different outputs from that fungus, and so they'll only go to certain species of tree to get the healthiest form of the sugars out of those fungus in order to survive. So all sorts of really unique relationships that insects have built with native plants.
They're gardening.
They are. They're gardening. They're farming. They're farming the fungus. It's phenomenal. And then when it comes to pollinators, we tend to think the sort of the poster child for pollinators right now that everybody talks about and wants to protect is the bees. But most people end up talking about the honeybee, which is European. European honeybee is what you see in hives. The vast majority of our native bees in North America are solitary bees, so they don't have hives. They will either nest in hollowed stems, like I showed before. They'll nest in the ground. They'll bore holes into dead wood, tree snags, and lay their eggs in there. But they're not the hive bees that you tend to see. And when it comes to specifically for crops, right? We hear about bee farmers or beehive owners taking those hives to farms and allowing the farms to use them to pollinate their crops if they're not pollinating very well, or they just need to ensure more pollination. But in reality, most of our native bees are more effective at pollinating our crops than the honeybees are. The honeybees are great because they're portable and they're more reliable. You know that they're going to be there. But when it comes to viability of seed, when it comes to fruit nutrition and output and yield, our native bees tend to do a much better job than the honeybees. And you get, like I said before, you have these different relationships with all these different plants and animals. And those different flower shapes and flower structures and colors and bloom times, all those sorts of things play into the types of insects or the types of animals that pollinate them. Up here in the left, you've got a coreopsis with a honeybee on it, or not honeybee, one of our native bees on it. And that's sort of what you'll see more commonly in a lot of our pollinators. They just kind of crawl across the tops of the plants, pick up the pollen, fly to the next one. But then you have ones like this flower up here in the middle. Does anybody recognize that? That's the blueberry. It's our high bush blueberry. All blueberries are native to North America, by the way. There are none that are native to anywhere outside North America. So this is the high bush blueberry. which is in the heath family, the rhododendrons, azaleas, deerberry, a lot of those ones, all in the same family. And a lot of them rely on what's called buzz pollination in order to be pollinated. What happens is, typically with bumblebees or larger bees, they're able to go in there, and instead of going into the flower and reaching into it, that thing is not going to be able to reach into that tiny flower. It hangs onto the flower, and it buzzes and it shakes the pollen out onto it, and then it moves on to the next plant. Again, very specific type of pollination that other bees are not going to, not going to be as effective. Top right, you've got the ruby-throated hummingbird and coral honeysuckle. If anybody has seen that, it's beautiful, beautiful flower. Blooms everywhere from February into early December. We have some in our front yard, and I see blooms on it almost year-round. And hummingbirds are at it almost every day, fighting for space. And then there comes a sort of a less measurable quality to our native plants and our native ecosystem, which is our culture and the relationship we develop with these plants. How do we connect with the land? How do we craft, and how do we come up with materials that are local, that are more sustainable, that we're not having to ship from all over the place? What can we rely on here that will work for us? What are the combinations of flowers? What are the landscapes that you're going to see here in the Southeast that you're not going to see anywhere else without having to try to reconstruct the entire ecosystem? What are the types of crafts we can build? These are baskets made by the Cherokee Nation. The Catawba and the Cherokee Nation both had basket weaving history. The Catawba has lost some of that history over time, but they've retained their pottery. Their pottery is made from clay that comes only from one specific spot on the Catawba River. It's very specific makeup to it that results in the look that it has. And then down here on the bottom left, does anybody recognize what that guy is dressed up as?
Paw Paw?
Paw Paw, yes. The American Paw Paw. This is the largest native fruit to North Carolina, to North America. Largest native fruit. They have a Paw Paw festival in Ohio every year. This year is the 25th anniversary. They do everything from ciders to ice creams to they just have a whole festival around it. You can't cook Paw Paws. When you heat them up, it kind of ruins the taste. So a lot of the things that you'll see Paw Paws in are cold dishes and desserts. But they're fascinating. And if you've never seen one, you've never opened one or tasted one. Anybody tasted one here? How would you describe the taste?
It's like a custard, mango, banana. It's so yummy.
It's a very distinct taste. It has sort of that tropical, like you said, mango, banana sort of taste to it, and it's got this. They're called custard apples. It's another name for them because when they're ripe, they're very mushy. And if you find one that's firm at all, don't eat it. You're not going to be happy with yourself. They've got these great big seeds. They grow in these thick stands, usually in our wetter, shadier areas. We've got a big stand just down the hill from us in the Greenway. I just collected a couple dozen from there to collect seeds. Our local chapter of the Native Plant Society does a seed share every December, so we have people from all over collecting throughout the season and coming and sharing those. So hopefully I'll have some Paw Paw seeds this year. And then over there on the left, you have the Eastern Tiger Swallowtail, which uses this as a host plant as well. The Paw Paw does not have a very good shelf life. It doesn't hold for very long before it goes bad. So you're never going to see it in the stores. And so it's one of those sort of get it while you can sort of fruits, and it's very special relationship built with it. They are starting to grow Paw Paws more widely across the world, but they are native to here. They have a pretty wide range. They go all the way up into southern Canada, which is very, very far north for what's considered to be a tropical fruit. So the next question people tend to have is, okay, I'm excited about native plants. I'm sold. How do I get started? I've got my yard, and I want to replace everything with natives. My suggestion is to start small. Start with a handful of species that you're familiar with, or filling in a couple spots rather than immediately ripping everything out. If you just don't have the space and you want to rip stuff out, go for it. I'm not gonna object to anybody ripping invasives out of the yard and replacing them with natives. So this is our house here. This was about 4 years ago. We had all this lawn that we didn't use, which most people don't use their lawn for a whole lot. If you've got kids and they're active, running around using it, that's great. But most people have their lawns; they don't do anything with it aside from mow it once or twice every week. And what I did, I just started by first adding a bed here in the middle, and then over time extended this bed out and added a new one here. And it's taken to it so well. I have not really had to water this more than maybe a handful of times this season. They do very well with our sun, and you'll find that some they aren't going to do well. That's why I say start small, figure out what grows on your property, what does well before you just go all in and buy a ton of it. So starting from seed is a good way as well, but and doing some soil tests on your property to figure out what may or may not work. And like I said, right plant, right place. Listen to the plant. If it's not doing well on your property, maybe you don't understand something about your property. Maybe you don't understand something about the plant. It may not be that you're a bad gardener. It's just, like I said, they've adapted to live in very specific sort of scenarios. Some of them are more generalists, like black-eyed Susans or things like that that'll just grow wherever you throw some seeds down. So here's I got some examples on the next few slides of some of my favorite native plants. These first ones are just wildflowers. The top ones are going to be your full sun, more of your prairie sort of flowers. Bottoms are going to be your woodland flowers, your shade gardens. Mountain mint, up in the top left, there's several species of mountain mint. This particular species, hoary mountain mint, Ignanthemum uticum, was just named the #1 pollinator of all native plants in the Southeast. Far and away, every single category they measured it in, it outperformed all of the other plants. It just puts out so much pollen and so much nectar that you'll see, and you also get a very wide range of pollinators coming to this. You go out there and see 8 or 9 different species of pollinators out there at any given time. In the middle, you got rattlesnake master, Rhingium yuccifolium. It's called yuccifolium because the leaves do look like yucca, where they have sort of that spiked look to them. And they're fascinating looking plants. Again, very great pollinators. To see insects on these all the time. And they create just these really interesting seed heads in the fall and winter. But a lot of the other stuff that's died back, you get some really nice winter interest with that. Cardinal flower on the right is blooming about now, depending on where you have them in the area. We have a bunch blooming on our greenway right now. Hummingbirds love this thing. Hummingbirds tend to go for red tubular flowers. These have a very narrow kind of tube that they go into for the nectar, and they're just stunning. You can spot cardinal flower from 100 yards away if it's just this tiny little red just popping out of the landscape. Bottom left, you got Trillium. This one's called Little Sweet Betsy. It's just my favorite name for any of the Trilliums. We have lots of Trilliums in our woodland areas, especially as you go up into the mountains. A lot of species at the Botanical Garden, if you've ever gone there early in the spring, it's just filled with Trillium. Again, one of those plants that after it's bloomed in the spring, the entire plant tends to die back down to the ground. It's not going to want to lose water from its leaves throughout the summer if it's not getting sunlight, because all of the trees over top have developed their canopy. Green and gold here in the middle. This is becoming more and more reliable to find in nurseries. Not so much in, I wouldn't recommend going to any big box stores, they're just really not going to have them. But a lot of your nurseries can find this, and this is a phenomenal ground cover. You can walk on this, it tolerates walking. It blooms, I'd say 4 or 5 months out of the year, more heavily in the spring, and then it kind of peters out throughout the year. But it is evergreen as well. It doesn't die back at the end of the year. The leaves don't go brown. So it is a really good alternative ground cover for your shadier, dry areas, like under trees, where you just can't retain water very much. It's not very moist. They do very well in that area. And last one here is bloodroot. Again, very early springtime bloom, beautiful white bloom. They're about this big. They're called bloodroot because their roots are blood red. There are some medicinal qualities to the roots that indigenous people used, but they are just fascinating to watch come up. You'll also see they tend to only have one leaf. See this leaf just kind of wrapped around, it comes out and just unfolds into this, I can't quite describe the shape, but they're just beautiful looking leaves, really cool vein patterns in them as well.
I had a little patch in the woods behind my house. When I saw it, I thought it was a grocery bag that had blown into the woods. I
Oh, the
thought it was
leaf?
a white. I saw the white. That's
Yeah.
all I saw.
Yeah.
Till I got out there, I thought it was a grocery bag.
Yeah, we have one or two patches in the greenway near us, and I always, like the last couple of years, I've tried to go back and find them early in the spring and get some pictures of them. And I always go a little bit too early. I always get a little too excited, and then when they pop up all at once, it's hard to miss because it's just bright white that sticks out in all the brown that time of year. Native trees and shrubs. So up top I've got trees. Yellowwood. I haven't been as familiar with that until the last year or so, but it is, if you're looking for a replacement for something like Bradford pears, this blooms early in the spring, beautiful white flowers that kind of dangle down more like wisteria. They have that sort of shape or effect to them. It's a host plant for over 100 species of insects. Very great for wildlife. Beautiful fall color, turns this very, very bright yellow. And the bark has a really interesting kind of smooth texture to it that's really catches the eye. The flowering dogwood, our state flower, fantastic understory tree, smaller for around the house. And then you've got your scarlet oak. Any of your oaks, if anybody is familiar with Doug Tallamy, The Nature of Oaks, his book that he put out, oaks by a long shot are the best host plants for insects or pollinators, beetles, ants, wasps. I mean, they host more life in their branches and in their roots too. Cicadas tend to feed on oak roots than any other species of tree. They can get very big. People are afraid to plant oaks in their property because they do get so large. But scarlet oak in particular just has this stunning fall color that you can spot from a mile away. And something we tell people that if they have that question of, I want to plant trees or I want to plant an oak tree, but I can't plant it too close to my house. What I've heard, and I'll mention a conference that I went to the last couple of years where they talk about this, is instead of planting one tree, plant 3 trees and plant them close together. Because what will happen is they won't grow as quickly as they would by themselves. They're fighting for each other's nutrients, but also they will provide different shade at different times of day to each other, so they won't always get the same amount of sunlight that they would if you just planted one tree. And also, when it comes to our heavy storms coming through and hurricanes that hit the south this time of year, the more trees you have in the area, especially if you plant them young and they're able to develop their roots from a young age, their roots just start to interlock with each other, and it forms this matrix underground that when these strong winds come through, they're much more likely to hold themselves up by each other's roots, rather than if you had one out in the field. The only thing holding that down is the shallow roots of some grass, and it's going right over. So that's one approach to if you want to plant some big trees in your yard and keep them from getting big too early. On the bottom, we've got native shrubs. Beautyberry is one of my favorites. I've got a few in our backyard. The purple on those berries, that photo is not enhanced in any way. They're just an unreal deep purple. They're starting to fruit now. A lot of them have already gone purple. This is, if you're ever looking at the Latin name of these in the stores, Calocarpa americana is that one. I've seen Lowe's and Home Depot sell what they call American beautyberry. They market it as the common name, but it's actually Chinese beautyberry. The berry structure is different. They don't look like these where they're all tightly compacted, almost like a raspberry or blackberry. They kind of hang down and they're a little bit more separated. They're smaller berries, and they just don't have the same ecological importance. Yopon, one other thing on beautyberry, the leaves emit phytochemical that tends to help prevent or deter mosquitoes. So if you have bad mosquito issue in your backyard, consider planting a few of these. Or you can take the leaves, crush them up, and rub them on your skin, and it can help repel mosquitoes as well. In the middle, you've got Yaupon holly, Ilex vomitoria is the Latin name. Don't let the name fool you, though. It was sort of a misunderstanding with an old Catawba tradition in drinking a Yaupon drink that then the people regurgitated as part of a cleansing process for this ritual. But really, they missed this. The people that document it missed the whole step where they stuck their finger down their throat and made themselves throat, and they blamed it on the drink. So it got kind of a bad rap, got kind of a bad name. But it has these beautiful red berries in the winter that the birds absolutely love. It is also the only known plant native to North America that produces caffeine. So you can actually use these leaves and brew, sort of an equivalent to coffee or tea with some caffeine. And then on the right, you've got dwarf fothergilla. I just think it's one of the most interesting flowers. It's blooming early in the spring, has beautiful fall color to it. These ones get, about yay big, and just stunning flowers to the pollinators that time of year. It's really important when we're talking about gardening for wildlife or encouraging pollinators and things like that, that we have flowers that are blooming all year round, right? We don't just want a bunch of summer blooms and then they don't have any food in the spring or fall. And so really making sure that you have some early spring blooms, some late fall blooms is really important for that. Two of the vines I've got up here, coral honeysuckle that I mentioned before. Again, just this beautiful pink, red color to it. Blooms most of the year. And then you've got Carolina jessamine, state flower of South Carolina. We have our entire mailbox is covered in just one big Carolina jessamine vine that took off in, maybe a year. It covered the entire mailbox. A very prolific grower. We cut it back probably twice a year because it just gets, unruly. Yeah. The other vine that I was going to have on here that I thought I'd put in is poison ivy, which a lot of people kind of get confused by that. But as long as you know what poison ivy looks like and you know to avoid it, it's a great wildlife plant. It is a host plant for a wide range of species. It also puts out, if you notice, these little white berries towards the end of the year that are higher in protein than most of your other berries that are out there that time of year. So for your animals that are struggling to find food in the winter, they're a very great source of protein to help them get through the winter. Another sort of opinion I heard on poison ivy was that poison ivy, you tend to see it growing in disturbed areas or at the edge of the woods, areas where part of the environment or part of the habitat has been cleared, and vines tend to grow in areas where you get that high amount of sunlight all of a sudden coming in because you don't have your tree canopy anymore. And so poison ivy, the person I talked to, he described it as sort of a warning sign, of saying, let this part of the habitat be for a little while, let it rebuild. And that's nature's way of saying, stay away for now. It's one way to look at it. And then some grasses down here in the bottom. Like I said, our turf grasses, we have, I would say, one native grass that I know of that would really be considered an appropriate turf grass. That's St. Augustine grass. I don't have it on here, but you'll see it mostly growing down more towards the coast. It likes sandier soils more so than our clay soil, but it's just not necessarily the prettiest turf grass. And so there's not a ton of turf grasses. I recommend ground covers more than I would turf grasses. There's some carex species as well that might do all right with some trampling, but not a whole lot. But the ones I've got here are more ornamental in terms of their structure. So you've got little blue stem here on the left. You've heard a little blue stem, and big blue stem. They're actually not in the same genus at all. But they have similar shape to them. This little blue stem will get about yay tall, and this has a lot of cultivars that I've seen out in the stores. You'll see this a little bit more in your big box stores. And they have a really interesting color to them. They get some blues and some purples in there and some reds. And all of these just have some really great fall interest or winter interest when everything else is pretty much dead for the season. Pink mealy grass here, which a lot more people are familiar with that, is native to this area. broom sedge here on the right. It's one of those plants that it looks like it belongs in a prairie, especially when it's dried out for the year, and it looks like something you would make a broom out of. And it's this just tan color. Puts out these beautiful seed heads, though, that are great for birds, great for wildlife, and then birds will also tend to come and grab pieces of this grass, pieces of your little blue stem, and tear those off and make nests out of them. So all of these different types of plants, all of these different plant structures, animals are going to find a way to use that to get through. So the next question is where to find native plants. That's what we get asked all the time, and there's not a great answer to that just yet. The market is still shifting, still trying to adapt. I just went this summer to an event that Metroline Greenhouses held up in Concord area, and they distribute to I think 15 different states, and they distribute to Walmart, Lowe's, Home Depot, a lot of big box stores. And the reason they asked us to come and set up a booth was because they've been hearing from the customers at all these big box stores, where are your natives? Why don't you have natives? So these bigger growers are trying to figure out how do they get into the native plant trade. And I think that the answer that they're finding is not the one that they hoped, which is a lot of what they try to grow things that are uniform. They try to grow things that they can just divide and clone them. And when it comes to talking about native plants and the importance of native plants, a big part of that is biodiversity and having not having clones of the same species. So if a pathogen or something comes through and wipes out one of them, it's going to wipe out all of them. You want that biodiversity to create a more resilient ecosystem. And so I think what they're going to find is that it's just not going to be as easy for them to grow a lot of these natives in the same way that they're growing a lot of the ones that you see in the stores now. Another thing that I'll mention when it comes to your big box stores and cultivars or these cultivated varieties that they sell in the store with name brands. Those name brands, they cloned one specific plant that looked the way that they wanted it to look, and it's either got variegated leaves or different bloom color or a different growth size or structure to it. And when it comes to invasives particularly, a lot of people will say, well, I've got Andean in my yard, or I've got burning bush in my yard, things like that, and I've never seen it out in the wild. Chances are you have, but you may not recognize it, because those cultivated varieties, that's just one variation of that plant. And the children that come off of that plant may look like the non-cultivated variety, look like what the plant normally looked like. Privet is a great example of this, where you see privet sold in the stores with these beautiful, deep green, glossy leaves that are about that big. You see them growing out in the wild, and they look a lot more scraggly. They look a lot more weedy, and where they're taking over, they have these very small leaves to them that don't look like something you sell in the store. And that's why you don't necessarily recognize them. That's why people don't necessarily make that connection to say, yes, my invasive plant is having effects somewhere else in the ecosystem. So when it comes to finding native plants, the Native Plant Society on our website, so ncwildflower.org is our website. That's for the whole state. And we have a page on there. If you scroll all the way to the bottom of the website, there's a list of native plant nurseries. And so we have a map that you can play around with, and we've got nurseries that we will add in there every few months that have to meet certain criteria for us. That would be things like they propagate all of their own plants. They don't have someone else growing them. They don't sell any invasives. And there's a couple other criteria that they have to meet. But the ones you'll find on here are guaranteed to have mostly, if not all, native plants, depending on who you speak to. I don't know of one close to here without going to like South Charlotte that's on this list. But a lot of your local nurseries will be able to order native plants for you if they don't have them, or they're usually willing to do that if you let them know what you're looking for, or if you just go in and just keep asking for native plants. I mean, that's going to be the biggest thing to kind of shift the market, is everybody just has to go in and start saying, I'm tired of English ivy and privet and crepe myrtles. We've seen them all over the place and they're not great. What can you give me that's native? And that's really going to be the only thing that's going to start to make these more available in the stores. Like I mentioned, our chapter does a seed share event every December. We have, last year we had probably 80 people or so there, and we do a panel discussion and examples of how to collect certain types of seeds, how to clean them, how to prepare them, store them, and then different methods for sowing them and trying to grow them yourself. I've had a lot of success with that over the last couple of years, using nothing but just potting soil, and then taking some dry leaves and crushing them up as mulch. I set them outside for the winter and let them go, and they do just fine. I don't have to water them all the time or anything like that. They're built for this environment. They're built for this ecosystem. They're going to do well. If they don't, there may be some different techniques you need to use for certain seeds. But by and large, I grew probably 30 different species of native plants last year, 30 different species of seeds, and I got at least 25 of them to germinate. Some of them only got a couple seedlings out of them. Some of them I have way more than I could ever use. But that's probably going to be the easiest way to start getting those into people's yards and getting into your yards, is find a place where you can access some native seeds and try and grow your own. And then if you want to learn more about native plants, UNC Charlotte Botanical Gardens, if anybody's been to their botanical gardens, beautiful place. They actually have two sections that are all native. There's the Mellichamp Native Terrace, and then there's sort of the native wildflower garden. The native terrace was designed specifically to, as an example of how to do formal gardening styles with all natives. So you have a very structured look to it, using a couple different cultivated varieties of natives to get the types of structures you want. But it's possible to take what we typically know of as that traditional gardening look, or the traditional kind of structured look, and replacing natives in each of those places. But personally, I'm going to try to move away from that traditional look in a lot of ways, but there's options there. They also have a certificate of native plant studies program. They've been doing that for many years now. I'm about halfway through the program right now. They have programs on basic botany and ecology, to different types of plant ID, to everything from botanical illustrations. They have all sorts of little courses that all focus on native plants. You can take it at your own pace. They're usually 1 to 3 session courses, so it's not like a full semester class or anything like that. It's for gardeners like yourself that are just looking to learn a little more about the topic. It's a great program.
Is that online? Or
They do most of their programs, depending on what it is. If it's an ID course, or if it has a field requirement in it, part of it can be online, but parts of it will have to be in person out in the field. But a lot of them do offer Zoom options as well. Yeah, I did. I started it during COVID, or at the end of COVID, beginning of 2021, when they still weren't having anything in person. So I got kind of spoiled with that, but then now a lot more of it is in person. But they do offer hybrids. Some books I recommend as well. Some of these are over here. These first two on the left are both by Dr. Larry Mellichamp. If any of you are familiar with him, he passed away last year right about this time. But he was the name in Southeast natives, particularly in the North Carolina area. His specialty being carnivorous plants. Everybody knows the Venus flytrap, right? That is native only to the Carolinas, only the Carolina coasts. We have plenty of other carnivorous plants as well that he created a couple different varieties of. But these books are fantastic. The one on the bottom is a lot more in depth than the one on the top. The one on the top, you'll see it over there. It's more of a starter guide. Nature's Best Hope and Bringing Nature Home talk a lot more about this. This is Doug Tallamy, talk a lot about the ecology of native plants and why it's important to bring them into our home gardens, where so much real estate in our country is in home gardens or home lawns, and how we can make a big shift just within our home areas. Our Native Bees. Wilding is a story of, this one's from the UK, but it was an old castle lands. They tried farming on for years and years. The land became depleted because they weren't treating it the right way, and it's a story of them bringing in native plants, native animals, to really restore the ecosystem there. It's a fascinating case study of what's what's considered rewilding, as you'll hear people call, is like introducing what used to be there into the ecosystem. And then Braiding Sweetgrass, if any of you have read that one, it's just a beautiful book. Robin Wall Kimmerer, she's also written a book called Gathering Moss. She does study moss specifically, but this one is much more general. And then Finding the Mother Tree, a lot of great information on the relationships of trees and their underground connections and how mother trees communicate with their offspring. Really fascinating book. Some podcasts. Some of the ones that got me interested. A Way to Garden with Margaret Roach. Anybody's listened to that one? A lot of these are out of the Northeast, but they have speakers from all over the country. That's what got me into native plants. In defense of plants, this one called Plants Are People Too. He's out of, I want to say Asheville area. And they play podcasts. All have really great topics. And then the nature guys, it's kind of all over the place. They talk about animals and fungus as well, but they do talk a lot about every year, the third weekend in July every year for the last 40 years, they've been holding a native plant conference up at Western Carolina University up in Cullinan. It's a 4 or 5 day event. They have hikes that you can go on with guides. They have workshops and all sorts of speakers and presenters throughout the week. They have native plant nurseries that come and set up shop. And it's, last year was my first time going. This is my second year. I will continue to go for as long as I can. It is just a phenomenal time. It's not necessarily what you think of when you think of an academic conference. It's very laid back. It feels, someone described it this last year as more like summer camp. It's just very laid back. It's at the end of the weekend they have a talent show to wrap up the weekend. It's a fun time. They just have phenomenal speakers from all over the Southeast. And then some organizations if you want to get involved. So like I said, I'm with the North Carolina Native Plant Society. You can, all of our monthly events that we have, so I mentioned the second Sunday of every month we meet at Reedy Creek. Those are open to the public. You don't have to be a member to join those. We do usually 2 to 3 events in the fall and 2 to 3 events in the spring that are members only. Like hikes and things like invasive plant removals or installing native beds on properties. Then you've got the Wild Ones. They just set up their first chapter in Charlotte at the beginning of this year. Linda Nelson runs that. They do similar work to us, but they focus more on getting native plants into the home gardens. That's really their focus. Gaston County, Piedmont Area Wildlife Stewards. Good group to get involved with as well. They are similar to, we have the Charlotte Wildlife Stewards in Charlotte, which is the local branch of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, which is the state branch of the National Wildlife Federation. And then for Friends of Plant Conservation, they've actually got a group, or they've actually got a presentation. I'll get the information if anybody's interested. Next month at Red Lair Preserve, I believe. They've got a 2-day event with speakers and presentations and hikes as well, if anybody's looking to go out to that. It's open to the public as well. I think you do have to register for the event, but you don't have to be a member of Friends of Conservation. And with that, I will open up to questions.
I kind of have a compound question for you. The blight has totally killed 100% of the dogwoods on my property. Okay, so is there a blight-resistant dogwood, and how do conservation groups like what you're involved with, if there is such a thing, how would they feel about the reintroduction of those dogwoods into where the dogwoods were once?
I mean, reintroduction, as long as it's our native species, or what you'll see, for
Well,
example.
see, if there's no blight, if it is not blight tolerant, it would just be a matter of a year or two before they're dead.
So I don't know about dogwood specifically. The American chestnut is the other big one. The chestnut blight came through and wiped out
Yeah, but that's still prevalent and that's still killing them.
Sure, and
You want nothing to do with that.
right, and what they've
It'll
started
kill
to
you
do.
too.
Yeah. What they've started to do with that is they have started to hybridize it with taking some genetic material from Asian species of the chestnut
Right.
that are tolerant to that, and reintroducing those back into the environment. And that has been doing. I haven't heard the same thing with dogwood, but there are some non-native dogwoods as well that are probably resistant to blight. And maybe an option, but nothing I know of that's readily available.
Right.
And with the chestnut, the chestnut's really interesting too because it's one of those really well-known ones that's being wiped out, but it's not been nearly as much wiped out here in the south as it has up in the northeast. Most of the research done on the chestnut was done up in the northeast, and to be honest, a lot of them didn't listen to southern researchers that were down here saying, "Hey, we've got huge stands of them still out, like Alabama, Tennessee,
Right.
still has a lot of them." It's because there's a genetic difference between ours and theirs. Still the same species, and they can cross-pollinate. But
Same thing with elm too, if I
Yeah.
remember correctly.
yeah, and they've got diploid species up in the northeast, where we have tetraploid species down here. Just there's just more genetic diversity, more genetic material that seems to be more resistant to that blight. So we may find that there are, the same thing with recognizing the diversity we have in our area. We may have species or variations of the dogwood that are thriving here in certain regions or with certain genetic material in them that we can cross-pollinate or we can mix with those dogwoods to resist the blight. But I don't know specifically about dogwood blight. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question. I was gifted a plant, and it doesn't look cover, but it's kind of invasive. It is a violet.
Mhm.
Is that native to this area, or what do you know?
Probably. Is it taking over wherever you see it?
That's what the lady gifted to me.
Yeah.
because I have not planted in my yard yet. It's still in a pot.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't sure.
It'll make it out. I can almost guarantee it. It'll spread. It'll spread underground once you plant it on the ground. But it also the seeds, the insects will take the seeds and scatter them. We have a lot of our front yard. I stopped. I mow maybe once a month at this point. A lot of our yard is kind of taken over either with some clover or some other weeds, or a lot of it is those violets right now.
So is
They are native. They are native. We have a lot of native violets. Just the tiny little herbal flowers. They're great for wildlife. Great for pollinators, especially early on. Like I said, in the spring when not a lot of other stuff is blooming.
Where's the best place to plant them? I have a clay front yard, a sand backyard, and the pasture is more like just dirt. So.
I would go for the pasture if you're not looking for them to take over. They spread pretty quickly in our front yard. I tried at one point to go through and dig out individual pieces and just try to get rid of it. It takes so long. It's just not worth it.
What about goats?
Goats will eat it. Yeah.
The goats wouldn't trample it away.
They're not going to trample it away. No, you're going to be hard pressed to get rid of it. Even if you walked on it a bunch, it'll keep coming back. It's pretty hard.
It gets into all of your flower beds.
It's easier in like the mulch.
In the pasture.
Yeah. And it's easier in the mulch flower beds to just kind of yank them out. It's when they get into the clay that's a little harder to pull out because you really have to dig to get them out of there. So I don't know if they'll do as well in the sandier soil. The pasture, you should probably do fine.
That's probably where I'm thinking in the pasture.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure. Her front yard was just getting covered.
Yeah, they'll take over pretty quickly. And if you're they're gorgeous when they're in bloom. But yeah, they can just kind of push some other stuff
Full
out.
sun's fine, shade's fine.
Yeah, our front yard's full sun. We have some that have, as we transplanted some plants around our property, the violet snuck in with that plant and has then started to spread in the backyard, which is mostly shade. They'll do fine. They don't need that much sun, but they could do fine in full sun.
So that's good.
The rabbits
I
really
have
enjoy it.
lots of rabbits,
Yeah.
squirrels, and goats, and deer, and
Yeah.
all of that kind of stuff.
We're fortunate enough that we live in the university area off of Harris Boulevard, and we're not we don't get deer as much. They don't make it up as close to the road as we are, luckily, but we do get rabbits and squirrels. The deer? Yeah. One thing I wanted to mention, I meant to talk about earlier when we're talking about invasives and native plants. There's two other terms that you'll hear mentioned, and again, they kind of depends on who you ask what the definition is. The first one is naturalized species. So this is what's considered naturalized as something that's non-native, but isn't considered invasive. It doesn't grow too rapidly to control, and in a lot of cases, I mentioned 90% of insects can only eat the one type of, a handful of types of plants that they've evolved alongside. Some of these naturalized species, they're closely related enough to some of our native plants that our wildlife can still interact with them, can still get some nutrition out of them. And so that's what we're talking about when we say things like naturalized. So it's not native, but it's also not a problem right now. And there's a lot of our herbs or things like dandelion. Dandelion is not native. It's from Europe. It's a French name, and it'll spread rapidly, but it's also not. It's not taking over whole areas like you get monocultures of English ivy or things like that. And then the other term is aggressive. So people conflate aggressive and invasive a lot of times, and so call a native plant invasive when really they mean aggressive. And aggressive just means it grows really quickly. It's going to take over certain areas, but that's it. It's evolved to grow like that, but it's not going to. A lot of them will grow kind of in colonies, and they're not going to take off across your entire yard. But they're hard to. They're hard for other plants to kind of get into the mix with those colonies and have diversity in a certain area. But when we talk about aggressive, it can be native aggressive plants, but invasives are typically always considered aggressive, non-native plants. Any other questions?
Can you recommend any apps that would give you a chance to ID stuff? We hike a lot, and I just like to know what it is. I don't want to pick it and take it home. I just want to know what it is.
Yeah, honestly, I use just Google, just the Google app, the Google Lens search.
Right.
So you can search with your camera, and you usually get something pretty reliable with that. It depends on the species. I mean, there's things like goldenrod that they're so similar that you're not going to get specific species.
Oh yeah.
iNaturalist is the other big one. iNaturalist is a sort of a citizen science program where you can you go into the app, you upload a picture of what you got, and you can put a note in there of like what you think it might be. But then you have local horticulturalists or botanists that are on there looking at people's pictures and IDing them and helping kind of create like sort of tracking of what are the different plants in the area, so that for research projects they can look at things like iNaturalist to get some of their research data rather than having to go out into the field. And then the other one is called iNaturalist and Seek. Seek is a little more fun. It's a little more fun for kids. It's sort of like you get little merit badges for finding different types of species or different things like that. But that's more of you're taking a picture and you know what it is and you're just marking it off. You're checking it off the list. No one's coming behind you to.
Kind of like the bird books where you get to check off the ones you've seen.
Exactly. Yeah, and if you're wrong, you're wrong. You're going to find out later, hopefully. But iNaturalist is probably the most widely used one. All right. Any other questions, or we'll go ahead? Yep.
We've got maple trees
Mhm.
that have extensive roots,
Mhm.
and I cannot get anything grown
Yeah.
within 6 feet, 8 feet of them. I mean, the
Yeah.
roots are just awful, and they keep spreading.
Like I mentioned, green and
they're
gold.
huge trees.
This green and gold right here, they spread a lot like strawberries, just the way that they spread around. And they have very shallow roots. They don't need a whole lot of water. That could be great to kind of help establish and kind of, throughout the year, some of their leaves will die and they'll create a little bit of mulch underneath it and kind of help build that soil back up. But the other thing I say under trees, especially, because I know it's a lot of people will, like I said, break away the leaves every year, bag them up for the city to take away. But that's free mulch, really. And it's really healthy mulch for those trees because it's their leaves, it's the types of chemicals and compounds that they build as part of their body, and then they drop them, and so those are going to be much more easily broken down and absorbed back into that tree, and it helps build that healthy layer of leaf mold and rich soil on top to hold more water. Yeah, it's a struggle finding those sort of shade plants in the dry area. You may get mosses too to help establish, but green and gold is a really easy one, and it spreads so nicely. You can just take a couple clumps off of it and move it around, and it transplants very easily as well. All right. Well, if no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up. I'll stick around for a while if anybody has any questions about the Plant Society or just anything else that comes to mind. Thank you all.